Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
It is showtime, and welcome in. Here we go. It is April the 24th. It's Thursday, Game 3 of the Battle of Ontario. So all that excitement to come, and we'll get into the Battle of Ontario as we move forward. But today on the program, on the Ledger Ontario Politics Podcast, we will definitely talk about the final days of the federal campaign. We'll look at some of the polling numbers as things get tighter. We'll actually talk about their betting lines out there right now that get pretty interesting. I don't quite know who's betting on it, but clearly somebody's doing that because they're betting on just about everything. We'll talk about the ads this late in the campaign. There are tariffs to talk about, the threat of tariffs from south of the border, what the latest from Donald Trump. It just is on time because it seems every time we meet to record this show on a Thursday, there was a Wednesday announcement about tariffs in Washington. The subways, should there be sole source subway procurement here in Ontario? The Ontario government wants to do that. You remember it didn't work so well for David Miller years ago. And the school boards are under fire again. And if we got time, we'll get into this whole conversation about making things faster, speeding things up at what expense. And right now the concern is around the environment and the green belt. All right, around the table this morning, Keith Leslie is joining us. Of course, you see and hear him on CH television and a veteran observer at Queen's Park. Kathleen Wynne is the former Premier of Ontario. John Wright is our founding pollster. And we'll have I think he'll have a thought or two on how this whole thing plays out around. There's betting on this. And Tim Hudak not with us today, so playing the part of Tim Hudak is Amanda Galbraith from Oyster Group. And it's good of you to join us, Amanda. I know you've got your hands full with getting the kids out the door to daycare and everything else, but good of you to step in and join us on fill Tim's seat this week.
Thank you. I even slapped some makeup on in the 5 minutes I had. So there you go.
Well, that's more than Tim does.
Ready.
Yeah. That's more than Tim does. That's pretty good. Let's just kind of start in terms of these final few days. I saw your post to John the other day on Facebook. You were talking about the post-debate polling and how now we're starting to see some of that stuff. Last time we talked, you said, watch for Tuesday or Wednesday. Every time I open up an app or a news source or I listen on the radio or watch TV, the breathless headline is, it's getting tighter. And even if you look at, some of the aggregators, and I flash that number up from the folks at 338. This is the number that they have up there today. You can see, over the course of the campaign, I heard somebody say it's never been closer. Well, it was a lot closer at the beginning of the campaign, but I understand the issue here. The point being, there have been some shifts, significant or otherwise, in the way the polls have played out generally in the last 4 or 5 days. You're muted, John.
You would think after all these episodes I'd get used to it.
Well, we can give the dog a credit. Don't worry about the
dog. We have a dog in the house and who visits with barking every once in a while here. Look, I don't see a lot of movement. Do you? I mean, it's 42-38, 43-39, 43-38. I mean, there's not a whole lot of stuff. I mean, what we do have are some overnight polls with a margin of error of about 4.5 points. And if they're into different regions, it can be as much in British Columbia, such as, almost 10 points. So to come on and sort of go, wow, it's tightening up in British Columbia, I can see they're getting closer. I mean, with a 10-point margin of error, it's ridiculous. So I haven't seen a whole lot of change, but I have seen out of the 14 polling companies that have been putting out stuff, 3 of them have got really tight. I mean, almost dead even. But they're in the minority. So we haven't, I guess what I'd say is this, we haven't seen by today a lot of bounce from, if anybody was going to get any bounce from the debate, we haven't seen it nationally. It might be a little bit down in the regions. I'm looking at Quebec and it seems that the Bloc is getting a little bit more. The NDP are getting a little bit more, but nothing is really changing up above on the national scene. I would say that the last major polls are coming in the next couple of days, probably by Saturday. And the reason why those are important to watch is that the way polling is done nowadays is a lot of it is done online. It's huge panels. One of the panels I was looking at yesterday had, close to 600,000 people that are all randomized and vetted, and they've been using them for years, so it is accurate. But in the final days of the campaign, some of the major companies who can afford to do this actually lay on an extra set of polls, and it is using computer-aided telephone interviewing, so that you're able to get that pocket of the population who may be using telephone and blend them together, because there is a significant difference in terms of who answers the phone and who answers a survey online. So you'll get the major ones who will step up and do that, and then they will produce the final result. So in the final days, right up until Saturday, or Sunday, we'll probably get the definitive word from the pollsters. Right now, there's not a lot of change. What I'm looking for is two things. Number one is whether or not the NDP continue to rise in certain parts of the country. And if that's the case, it's stealing from the Liberals, which would bring them down like a pneumatic pump. The second thing, though, is a question on who turns out to vote. The first group we know turns out to vote, and that is boomers. Boomers turn out to vote. They're taxpayers. They have a particular view of the world, and they get out and they vote. Young men, though, who are over on the conservative side with boomers on the liberal side, young men don't vote that much. They may be angry. They may be with the party of grievance, but they don't get out and vote. So the question is whether or not the boomers, in fact, get out and vote that holds the liberal vote up, or the young people decide, nah, I'm not going to vote, and they stay at home, which drops the conservative vote. Beyond that, I don't have much to say until the final polls come out, but there's not been a whole lot of change. That's what I'm seeing.
Isn't that the story, though, Amanda? I mean, before the election, that when we look at that 338 graph, and that, the Tories were so far above everybody else, and then we got to the just before the writ was dropped, things are tightening up, and everybody saw this huge change heading into the election. They all kind of settled into their groove. And there really hasn't been, I mean, with some exceptions, really hasn't been a wide swing at all, one way or the other, except for the fact that maybe the Conservatives have hit some record numbers in terms of popular support ever, and they're still having a hard time getting any traction against Carney.
Yeah, it's it's incredible, right? I think the Conservatives are in the same polling territory that Stephen Harper was in when he won his majority. Yeah. But NDP were at almost 30. I think they were 30% or somewhere in that of those, and the Liberals were 18.9. I think was what the end of the results were. So I know that the big story is people want to talk about is the Conservatives blowing a 25-point lead, and that is certainly part of it. But to me, and I'm not actually spinning, I actually do think the big story here is the NDP blew themselves out of the water. I mean, Jagmeet Singh's probably going to lose his seat in this. And the Conservatives just don't have a vote coalition in this country without a strong NDP, right? We are a tri-party system. Like, we're not a two-party system. We're a tri-party system, well, then some, if you count the Greens. So I think, to me, we haven't seen a lot of movement there because, candidly, the Conservatives don't have a lot of place to go. Like, it's short of, Pierre Poilievre becoming, I don't know, like a hockey star and like whatever, like the guy that wins the Leafs game, puts them in the playoffs, or in the next round. I don't see how he goes any higher. The only option for us is if the NDP rise up. And yes, we're seeing some tightening or whatever, which, that can be some polls. Like, I don't actually know if that's happening, candidly. And all I care about really are the regional numbers and the NDP number regionally. And those really aren't budging to me. So that's really what I'm watching. It's what's happening in the GTA, what's happening in Vancouver, what's happening in other regions. And none of that stuff is shifting dramatically. So to me, the big story is if the NDP had triggered this thing in the summer, like they should have, they'd be the official opposition and Conservatives would be winning. And instead now the NDP are going to wipe it off the map and the Liberals get a fourth term, which is wild.
Well, Kathleen, even if, you start to see some of that rise in the NDP, in many cases, it's NDP versus Conservatives. So it's not even as if it's going to bite the Liberals' ass in that case to, in at the end of the day. So if there is a strength there for the NDP, it may come at the expense of the Conservatives as well, which is double damning.
Well, yeah. So I'd be very surprised if that happens. I don't know what would make that happen in terms of the NDP. And you're right, you're talking about blue-orange switch ridings, right? Not red, blue. Anyway, I have to tell you guys that this whole conversation just makes a huge knot in my stomach. As I've said to you guys before, my antidote to all of this, the polling, is to go out and knock on doors. Because the thing is, all of this conversation, it does obviously have an impact on the air war and what the central campaign does. But honest to goodness, it doesn't change what's going on in the ground. I was out in a campaign in Toronto on Tuesday, going out again this weekend. Everybody's just pulling out all the stops. And I was having a conversation with the candidate in Toronto this week and just saying, no matter what the polls say, you've got to run like you're 20 points behind. You've got to do everything you can to get out every vote. And that's what those teams are doing. So we're coming so close to the end now. I really hope that the volunteers and the candidates aren't looking at the polls, that they're just, their noses to the grindstone, and they're just doing what they have to do quite frankly, in all of the campaigns, orange, blue, red, green. That's what the campaign workers are doing. And the candidates are just trying to focus on that work and the people whose votes they're trying to win.
Keith, Leslie, with your view from Atlantic Canada, I thought it was interesting. We always say, where are the leaders going to be, particularly in the final week? And there was a real focus from the Liberals to still, drill down on what might be considered some competitive ridings in Atlantic Canada. They're not sure things for the Liberals, but that's precious time to be spending in the final days of the campaign. So there must be some confidence in the Liberal campaign in Atlantic Canada there.
I think there's a lot of confidence in the Liberal campaign in Atlantic Canada that there wasn't there in January. Which is why we saw Sean Fraser. Hey, I don't need to spend as much time with my family. I can be a candidate again. But I think as well, we saw Poilievre in Halifax as well. So he still clearly thinks that there's possibilities there for him. And I don't know the numbers that, they're so close, they're so tight. And to Amanda's point about the Conservative numbers, are as high as you could probably expect them to get. And they're still, they're just that little bit behind the Liberals. And of course, the Conservatives, as John will tell us, need to have points above the Liberals because of vote inefficiency. But one thing I wonder is how the Conservatives feel about spending $3 million to attack Jagmeet Singh as sellout Singh, simply because he wouldn't help them defeat the Liberal government when they wanted him to. Indeed, the NDP may have been the official opposition, as Amanda points out, if they had done that then, and we would have had a Conservative government. But now it's the NDP vote that's collapsed. That's led to, as to say, the CPC numbers are very high, but the Liberal numbers are higher because the NDP is virtually non-existent. The numbers did seem to increase a little bit for the NDP after the debate, so maybe all that interrupting and just trying to get noticed did help Jagmeet Singh at least, get some of those potential NDP voters who were leaning Liberal to come back to the NDP and say, we don't need to everybody go to Liberals. Their numbers are so high, we can safely elect some new Democrats. On the other thing, to John's point about whether the pollsters are now going to actually start using some phone polls where they talk to people, and let's face it, we're talking about people like me, old people. And I suspect that's why the government, the Conservative Party came out with that golf ad with two old guys standing on the golf course. Can you believe the Conservatives have to appeal to old white guys at this point in an election campaign because they're all going Liberal? It just seems bizarre, but that ad was, I think, a real low point for them. It doesn't mention Jagmeet Singh at all, and it was so open to mocking. I think it was within an hour I saw a spoof version of it put up, and it was basically talking about erectile dysfunction. So
yeah, I was gonna say that when I saw the ad on the cable news, I said either it's a reverse mortgage ad, or it's a life insurance ad, or erectile dysfunction ad, or where are my keys ad, and to me, the whole idea that they had to turn it around, and the applause that the campaign was getting was that this is how quickly they responded to it. But I'm not sure what bells was it hoping to ring here?
How's your son David?
Well, it's been a tough few years for him. He just can't seem to get ahead.
Yeah, we had to pay for Sarah's down payment last year. Things are tough for her too.
You know what Mark Carney says.
Come on, do you really think that a fourth Liberal term is going to change anything?
I've been thinking the same thing.
Are we really going to give these clowns a fourth term? I'm voting Conservative. There you go.
Yeah, for a change.
Yeah, so there's so much in there. I mean, the memes aside, Amanda, in terms of the messaging, we've got two guys who are clearly on the privileged side of life, who are able to actually put up money as the bank of mom and dad for their kids. And I understand that there's pressures in that. Playing a game that, is, again, a fairly privileged game. And it would normally be the conservative voters, to Keith's point. I thought, holy cow, they're raising a flag here that the war room's having, somebody's hair is on fire. If that was the ad that they were going to put out in the last week, that's their final messaging.
I mean, I think the reality is that male voters in that demographic have gone over to Mark Carney. Like, I think that's what it's telling all of us, which is, bizarro world, but we're also got the ads on favorites under 40, which is also bizarro world. I've never in my life. Like, normally I have to be embarrassed to say that I'm a conservative among people my age. I'm not under 40 anymore, but I'm going to just set myself in that bracket still. I don't have to do that anymore because a whole bunch of people who normally wouldn't vote for us are saying they're voting for us, where they actually make it to the polls is a whole other thing, right? So it's really upside down world. And I certainly think we are focused, and a lot of conservatives are certainly concerned and focused on like, why do we need this ad to exist in the first place? And I think it's just the Carney, whatever noblesse of I'm coming down from the Bank of England and Canada to save you from yourselves, and et cetera, is appealing to those. And he's calm and he's the adult in the room and whatever is appealing to those voters. So yeah, I think they obviously want to try and get them back, and that's the way they see it. I just want to say though, I think the idea, yes, obviously if you have money to give to your kids to help with their down payment, certainly that means you're doing better than the average Canadian. But I think the issue is that people who are not even doing that well anymore, if their kids want to have a chance, or taking money out of their retirement or taking money out of their savings and trying to help their kids in ways they haven't before. So I think that is actually like a real crisis conservatives are trying to speak to. And they've got that vote on the younger side of people saying, hey, I want to buy a house, but they don't have the equation on the older side. So you can argue, the look of it, the audio, it's cheesy. But I remember in 2006, we ran these like terrible ads. Patrick Mutar did them, and they were like, it was like a honk on a weird old television that people were watching, and we got panned for them. They were super successful. The honk worked because everybody would turn their heads to look at the sound if it was on. So I think sometimes ads, that's not an ad design for me. I guess maybe it could be an ad design for John and yourself if you golf. But I just think campaigns got to do what they got to do. And if they need to appeal to a voter, if they need to get that out there, sure. And if that is, somewhat jarring for us as strategists, like, okay.
Yeah, I've been proudly Canadian since 1960, so I would fall into that category. But I'm not a golfer, and again, I think I mean, this comes from my bias in terms of my communications background, and I don't say bias in terms of politics, John. But to me, the failure was in the message. They could have talked very much about what Amanda said, but the scenario is different. You had to talk about the relationship between you and your kids who are struggling to get ahead. I think that's where the tension is. It's not about the guys at the driving range.
Well, I don't, forgive me, I don't listen to everything in a commercial. I just kind of see it for what it is. I'm really glad that we got those two characters out of the balcony and into, those two old guys that are always the Muppets.
Statler and Waldorf.
Yeah.
Nice to see, a couple of clowns who are out there. I was struck by something that Lisa Wright, former Conservative cabinet minister, said on Vashi Kapala's show the other day. And that was that she was at the door and she said, you know what, I don't want my Conservative friends to hate me for saying this, but what I'm getting is that people really like the Conservative platform, but they want Mark Carney to deliver it. And I thought that was telling, because then it rolled into the next part. We've got two ads that I've seen. I see stuff on social media, but actual ads during the hockey game. There's this one that's playing out. And then there's Stephen Harper endorsing Pierre Poilievre. And I kind of looked at that and went, this is, if you don't like the Conservatives, this is yet another pounding of the nail. And you're getting Stephen Harper right in the grill for doing that. So I took it in a couple of ways. Number one is those two ads plus what Lisa Wright said, maybe they're off kilter a little bit in terms of their appeal, in terms of how they're messaging. That's the first thing. The second thing was that I remember in 2015 when Justin Trudeau actually had that sweep at the end of the campaign and brought a lot of people on board, particularly young people. And there was this double, if you remember in newspaper days, there was a double page spread. And it was him standing at the podium. It was looking out towards the crowd and his hand was up. And it was the messaging there was all about hope. I got no hope. I got nothing out of these ads. I have nothing from the Conservatives that says there's a better future. You know, it's all about dollars and cents. At least Mark Carney's kind of saying, you know, I've had the crises, you know, we got better days ahead of us and stuff like that. But I have no hope whatsoever. I wonder whether or not this is just the way in which the Conservative campaigns run nowadays. There doesn't seem to be anything there that gives me a motivation as a citizen to kind of look at this and say, you know what, that's a party that's got a bright future for me in it. What it is, it's a party of grievance. Mm-hmm. And I just think, you know, again, having these ads and the way in which it's positioned, I'm not sure it does anything to get them higher than where they are, either at the 38 or the 39%, whatever it is.
Well, to that point, Kathleen, if we talk about the Conservatives, as John said, is sort of this grievance party, the fact of the matter is there's 38, 39, 40% of the electorate out there who are, and I say this with all due respect, who are following that lead. You know, we can't ignore that. There's an issue here.
Absolutely. I mean, there is no question, Dave, that there are, you know, there's a substantial portion of the population that is really not happy with the way their lives are going. And I think what Amanda said about her peers, you know, there are young people who feel that they don't have the chance that they thought they were going to have, that their parents thought they were going to have. And, you know, I guess that's the undercurrent of that ad with those guys. At least one of them is not actually a boomer, you know, or he looks way younger than that. And there's no mention of Pierre Poilievre. I think the ad about Stephen Harper. Well, there may be a lot of people who like Stephen Harper who voted Conservative. Stephen Harper's not running, and the comparison is not between Pierre Poilievre and Stephen Harper. It's Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre. So they may long for those days when Stephen Harper was running. So I don't actually understand that ad. I don't understand using that ad. Anyway, I know that there are people who are hurting. They are discouraged. They're afraid for the future. And to John's point, what is needed is some kind of sense of a path forward. And when you have a leader who's been saying for 2 years that the country's broken and you all should be angry, and I'm going to tap into that anger and I'm going to yell about that anger, that is really hard to shed. I think that's what they're trying to do in these last weeks of the campaign. I think it's a really big hill for them to climb. The other thing I will say is, and Amanda, you used this language, I'm a boomer. I have boomer relatives and friends, and the adult in the room issue for people who have voted Conservative is really important. So they don't see Poilievre as the adult in the room, or as the person who can be the adult in the room at this point in our history. And I think that's why every time there's a shout across the border from Trump about the 51st state or about tariffs, Mark Carney does well, because people are very worried about the capacity of Pierre Poilievre to actually handle that situation. And that's where the adult in the room issue comes from. And I don't think I'm not sure that ad is going to change anything, but maybe it's why we're seeing the tightening. I don't know. Not a pollster.
Keith, I think the interesting part about this, and as Kathleen points out, we're putting Stephen Harper up front, and I understand why in terms of a response to, Harper. But on the other hand, where Poilievre wants to run against Trudeau, and then they're putting Harper out again, out front in the window for the Conservatives, there seems to be a good level of confusion in all that. At the same time, they have not yet, and I think it's way too late now, taken advantage of what's going on south of the border. I mean, we've got more, threats of tariffs from the president talking about auto tariffs increasing. I saw a piece this week from Flavio Volpe, Keith, and he was listing the number of interviews he has done since the beginning of the campaign, and that was last week, and it was around 500. So he's probably pushing close to 600. He's got more media presence in some cases than some of the politicians. But to me, on that, that's been a conservative blind spot for whatever reason. They have not kind of tapped into that anger or that fear or that anxiety, in addition to the other levels of anxiety around the economy.
I think because it doesn't play into their need for a change as much in the whole adult in the room. I think Carney is leading on that file and they know it. So they want to go back to what they've been hammering away on in the last 2 years. There is a lot of people, you talked about the 39 to 40% of people who are really, really angry at the Liberals after 10 years, the drinking game, the lost Liberal decade and drink. But there are a lot of people with some legitimate, they're rightly aggrieved about some things. And they are not prepared to give the Liberals another term, even if Carney is the leader. So I think this is what the Conservatives are focusing on right now, is trying to make sure that they, anytime you talk Trump or Trump talks about the tariffs, it seems to help Carney. So they're going to focus on their own platform. They've got a lot of policy ideas, taking the GST off cars, off houses, all these sorts of, there's some very, all of it addressing affordability issues and trying to, develop the pipelines, develop policies that the Liberals were in the way of before. So I think that offers a lot of people some real alternatives to think about. And it is so close because these policies are acceptable to people. And there's some people who, as I say, are rightly aggrieved. They just can't conceive of another 4 years of Liberal rule, regardless of who is leading the party. If Carney had been the Conservative leader, I think the Conservatives absolutely, someone who said that, absolutely the Conservatives would be, running away with this hands down in a Conservative majority, because it's about dealing with Trump for the most part. But I can understand, I really do understand the Conservatives' anger, because these terrible policies some of the Liberals had in place, they should be, punished for, and they're not going to be punished for. They're going to get reelected again. And the fear amongst the Conservatives I was talking to this week is all this stuff that Carney's going to bring back the capital gains tax. He's going to put a tax on your house profit. That all these things are coming that, we've heard. They're nowhere in the platforms yet, but there's this fear of the Liberals are just going to tax us to death because that's what Liberals do. So I think the Conservatives are, rightly trying to stay focused on that sort of thing, because there's a lot of, I think, feeling the same way across the country. But I think, again, it comes right back to Trump, and we just can't defeat him. I think the Liberals really, I wasn't surprised when the margins seemed to narrow this week a little bit, because the Liberals' campaign platform, this costed platform, where Carney came out with a whole new kind of math. I've covered something like more than 50 provincial, Ontario, and federal budgets. And if someone had presented to me in a budget lockup a document that said, well, the deficit is going to be 10 billion, but there's another 40 billion in investments that we're making, and we're counting those as assets. What? It's like a new kind of math, and it's the exact kind of thing Liberals do not need to be presenting to Canadians as a new kind of liberal math to fudge the deficit figures. I mean, the Conservatives platform, it doesn't balance the books either, and it relies on some, really big hopefuls in savings. But I think it's a little more realistic than what the Liberals put forward, at least in terms of what they're claiming is their deficit and their debt to GDP ratios. It's just nonsense. So I'm not surprised at all that the numbers narrowed a bit this week, because I thought the Liberal costed platform was a lot of BS.
Well, Keith, I just have to say, I think there was a lot of BS going on in both the platforms, to be fair. And I don't think, I think what he's talking about is operating and capital budgets. And I know you have been in rooms where that has been a conversation. I know
Absolutely.
for sure that there are places that do that kind of accounting. But, in terms of how Poilievre is going to balance the budget and cut taxes across the board, billions of dollars of taxes. Like, there's a lot of magical thinking to go around in terms of that platform as well, just to be fair.
The numbers didn't necessarily shift post-debate in terms of polling, but Amanda, you brought it to our attention that there are online betting lines that seem to have shifted over the last few days. And I point out to people when they talk about the betting line, it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is more or less likely to win or potential to win. It's that people think that they're more or less likely to win because that's where they're putting their money. So it was kind of interesting to see how this is emerging. And we can, look at it and say, well, it's sort of frivolous. It's just online betting and so on. But it really is at the basis of what, we saw with the campaign in the United States for 2024. And Nate Silver has become this, kind of force among all the pollsters and everything. He started out as a sports betting guy who covered baseball and did analytics. So there's something to this in terms of the mood that we're talking about. It touches on some of that, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure. So it's really interesting. I'm just doing a bit of work with BetMGM around how they've rolled out betting. They did it in the provincial election, and now they're doing it in the federal election. And it takes into account what people are putting their money, but they've actually been doing this in other jurisdictions for a long time. Like in England, for example, this is a very common thing to do betting on elections. And I've been watching the odds shift. And the odds started shifting, for example, towards a Liberal majority sooner than we were seeing some of the stuff in the polls, because what makes it up isn't just, yes, what people are putting their money, but they actually have like special analysts, I swear to you, that just do like they calculate political betting around the world. They look at vote efficiency, they look at polls, they look at the announcement, they kind of calculate all that stuff as well in keeping with what people are doing. And then they give you the odds of where they think things are going. So for example, right now they've just added, we saw the stories, yesterday about would the federal leaders lose their seats. So now you can take bets if you think that the leaders are going to lose their seats. Pierre Poilievre, it's like highly, like 12-1, he's not going to lose his seat. So if you put $100 on it, it's like not going to happen. But Jagmeet Singh, like much twice as likely to lose his seat is what the bet is. So I think those are some really interesting odds to me. Yves-François Blanchet appears to be safe according there. But there's some other things that have been interesting too, is around, yes, they think they're betting the favors right now is for a Liberal majority government, which again is an interesting conversation, because I think all of us are kind of like, I can see a Liberal government, but a Liberal majority? Like after this? Like really? But that is what people are either betting on and or folks are thinking. But the popular vote, that's a really tight back and forth there. So, and that has actually extended a bit more in the Liberals' favor over the last week. But to me, it's just another kind of data point as we kind of analyze, what Kathleen talked about, knocking on doors, right? And conservatives love to point to that, and I as well, especially right now. And I do think that is an important thing, because we saw pollsters can sometimes miss what's happening on the ground, or stuff shifts really quickly. But to me, this is just another really interesting data point for us. And also, I'm really bad at sports, but I feel like I could maybe make money betting on this stuff because I got some insight.
So did I hear you say they had run the online betting for the Ontario election, and there was not even a line on whether or not Doug Ford would win or lose?
Correct. Yeah, they didn't even bother, because it was whether. Yeah, exactly. It was for that, and then there's no money for them to be made there, right? So they didn't put that in there. It was more about would the Liberals or NDP come in as official opposition and some other things.
And to be clear, this would only be in Ontario, right, where we have online betting?
This is Ontario, yeah. Ontario.
So is this an OLG? Like, did they oversee this?
I'll be honest with you, I just commentate on sort of the odds and that kind of thing. I'm not familiar with the details.
I don't think,
it would be regulated by them.
Yeah, they'd regulate it, Amanda, I think, yeah.
Yeah. So I wonder, and I don't know this, but the odd thing is that, the provincial government has an opportunity to make some money on this betting.
Well, the provincial government certainly putting their finger on the scale a little bit during this federal election campaign, as the third time they've released internal polls in the last 4 weeks. So, which is another interesting dynamic that's happening.
One of the things I want to get to, and this has been an internal conversation, because, we can joke and it's a meme, it's the crosstown and transit, et cetera, but we are in need of new subway cars here in Toronto again. And I think it's interesting, John Wright, that this morning we heard that the Ford government is talking about sole source procurement for subway cars built in Thunder Bay. And, the whole point around this, and it just falls right into the narrative, if we don't do this, it's going to be subject to tariffs because it'll be an international buy, et cetera. It's interesting to see how that narrative is driven by the Trump posture. What was it, 15 years ago? David Miller was, drawn and quartered politically for trying to do the same thing.
Well, he was, but I remember that very clearly. And it was, two things that sunk him. One was the garbage strike. The second thing was this, but it was done in a different way, because it was Miller and the unions. I mean, his association with the union that, in fact, was driven home at that point. A lot of people were really upset about what the unions were doing at the time. And so that backfired on him. I think this is different. The last thing that citizen taxpayers want is to have costs thrown out the window. But on the other hand, we are at a time when you want to make sure that you've got, your own people protected so that you can invest, in these sort of things. And I do note, of course, that all of this is kind of pie in the sky until the federal government decides to put its capital allocation behind the subway, because it's a tripartite shift. But I don't think this should surprise many people that we're headed in this direction. I just think that, people will look at this and say, let's not take for granted that because we're Canadian, you can jack the price up because it's always going to come to you. It's got to be done prudently, but I think that the public will be behind this.
Kathleen, Wynne, it's interesting to hear how that has changed, but the assumption, though, is that by buying locally, shall we say, we're going to actually save money because of the potential of these tariffs or whatever. So that's the offset here that David Miller didn't have.
True. And I think, all of what John said is exactly right. I think that it makes sense in this context even more than before. And, you'll remember when we were building those Bombardier cars, so it's the same process in Thunder Bay. There was a real desire to have those jobs in Thunder Bay. And maybe the union was driving that, but I remember I was part of the McGuinty government at that point, and we really wanted to have those jobs in Thunder Bay. And I think it's the same situation now, except writ large. I think if you flip it around, Dave, and imagine those cars being built somewhere else, being built offshore, I think there would be a huge hue and cry about why are we doing that when we're up against this challenge from the south of the border. So I think this makes sense. And yeah, we have to be careful that we get the best deal possible, because these deals are not easy, and the quality control on the vehicles that are produced has to be really very diligent.
Yeah, Keith, it's sort of a simple no-brainer in some respects. I mean, if we're actually going to, plant the flag in this environment right now economically, this is a really good way for the Ford government to do it. I mean, and I can't see that the next, federal government is going to have much choice one way or the other with the mood out there.
As long as there's no other builder in Canada of transportation rail cars like this, in other words, we should at least be open to competition. We don't want to sole source something if we do have more than one producer in the country. But my knowledge of building rail cars in Thunder Bay goes back to the Urban Development Transportation Corporation, UDTC, when they set that thing up. We need to keep those jobs in Thunder Bay. And of course, this contract at this point, as you said, is a no-brainer. As long as we don't get to a situation where, and Canadians are known for this. If it's a government contract, well, we can tack on a little extra here. We can tack on a lot more here because it's a government contract, especially if it's a government sole source contract. There's no competition. So it has to be really, really closely regulated. And to Kathleen's point about the intricacies of keeping these rails on the line, the troubles we've had in the Ottawa light rail transit system are just, an example that no one wants to see repeated anywhere. And yet they haven't really resolved them yet. So it's a controversial issue in the sense that really we want the best rail cars in the world, and we want them at the best price in the world. But right now, politically, as you said, Dave, plant the flag. I mean, I just can't see Premier Ford doing anything else but planting the flag there.
But can I just say something? If I were in the Premier's chair right now, to Keith's point, I would make sure that there was a lot of information in the public realm about once the deal is signed or whatever, I'd make sure that there was a lot of information as the process unfolded. I mean, we've seen along the Eglinton Crosstown, the sort of obfuscation of information over the last few years has driven people to distraction. And I think that we need to, as Ontarians, we need to know what's going on. And when there are holdups, we need to understand why. We need to understand the timelines and really understand what is in the deal. I think that is very, very important in terms of the issues around lack of competition.
Yeah, and I think the mood around that particular point is probably as strong as the patriotic view of supporting the economy. I mean, I don't think we have a whole lot of tolerance for that lack of I mean, the number of people who I talk to who drive along Eglinton and are so excited just to say, I saw a test car on the tracks the other day, and we're still not clear exactly what any of that means.
But to Kathleen's point, what if we had timelines, public timelines, saying, here's what we expected to be on this, and here we would know right away how far behind we were. And this happens with all these projects. The Union Station overhaul, the same thing. How many years later was that? How much over budget? So if we're going to do sole source contracts to keep, the business in Canada, we need to have some very public deadlines and specificity about what's in this contract, what's required of the contractors. And if, we see this with Crosstown, they're basically pointing fingers at each other now. So this is not helping anyone. And so I think, again, we just need to be really, really careful in how we draw up these contracts and how we stay on top of them going forward.
And sorry, Dave, I'm on a bit of a hobby horse here, but I do not understand why it has been so difficult. And I was the Minister of Transportation when the first boring machine went in on the Eglinton Crosstown. Okay, so I was there. We were building that line, and I don't understand why there has not been more information over the last 6 years, not just about the timelines, but I think Keith's right. We needed to know the timelines, but what were the problems? What went wrong? Why would Carolyn Mulroney not come into my riding when I was still in the legislature and talk to the people along Eglinton and Leaside, who were my constituents? Why would they not talk to us about what was happening? And that has to stop. And I worked with Metrolinx as the minister. It was very, very hard even to get signs up on the hoarding to let people know what was being built. So there's been a culture both in the organization and now in this government of not being willing to share any kind of bad news or information, real hard information about what was happening. And I think that would have gone a long way to helping people kind of calm down if they'd understood, well, we hit electrical cords, we found stuff in the dig that we didn't expect, whatever the heck it was. Why not tell people so that they would understand what was going on? So I will stop.
And as we get more into these sort of the minutia and issue by issue, because we're the campaign in February, Amanda, was exclusively Trump, and we no matter how hard somebody tried to bring up the issues around Crosstown or whatever it might have been, that was deflected, and I think most people understand that just based on the headwinds that we were facing. But I think we're getting into a place where that's going to be more of an issue, that whole conversation around transparency. I mean, this discussion this week about the Ford government stepping in and taking over a school board. They're looking at the finances at TDSB, the Catholic board in Toronto, the question around how kids with disabilities are being treated in some of these classrooms. These are now becoming the issues that I think are going to grind the sand in the wheels for the government on a daily basis. Yes, we might still be at 100,000 feet and looking at the threat of Trump, but now that we're going to get back into the legislature sitting, and I realize it's pretty short term between now and when it rises for the summer, but there will be more of that happening that the Ford government's going to have to be ready to deal with in a way that kind of sounds like they're prepared and they aren't kind of stick handling bullshit.
Yeah. No one wants to stick handle bullshit. Yeah, I think any government in a third term is going to be faced with, lots of challenges, right? And no matter how popular, and I think this government in particular has benefited from the premier's sort of Teflon ability to slough off scandals, or even as sort of, which still he retains his ability to behave as an outside observer of his own government and say, yeah, that's really terrible. We should look into who's dealing with this. We'll fix it, right? People believe that about him, and it's still something that hasn't yet worn off. It will at some point eventually, I do believe. As far as them sort of taking, putting the gears to the school boards, my guess is a lot of Ontarians would welcome additional oversight, would welcome reviews, would welcome more kind of digging into those. I think they're frustrated by school boards, and I'm sure Kathleen has a very educated opinion about this, well beyond my own. frustrated by them. They see, you know, that the trip to Italy to buy the art is still something that is top of mind for me when I think of, which is just wild. So I think, yeah, these are going to be issues they're going to face, but they also have put a very capable minister in that portfolio, which is typically quite rocky, right? And Minister Calandra, who is good at managing down stuff like this. So I think they'll come up with some big, you know, we're going to be doing this, this, and this, and then he'll probably hopefully try and quietly manage stuff. I also, my guess is they will have some headline grabbing stuff they're going to do and some other portfolios to sort of drive the news cycle, you know, beyond like something like what they did with the bike lanes leading into the election campaign. They'll have a couple of those that they're going to roll out through the legislative session to try to drive things so they're not just being kicked around by the opposition. And then, of course, we'll have the summer where we all disappear, and they will, I'm sure, disappear. And the other thing I would just say about the Trump stuff, I don't know about you, but I'm up to here on it. Like I hear him talk now, and it's like the mom from Peanuts. It's like mom. I don't want to listen to it anymore.
Well, you're not alone there for sure. Kathleen, Wynne, a couple of weeks ago, then we were talking about the new cabinet, and you know, everybody looks at Paul Calandra and says he's the fixer. And I think you might have said, well, what is he going to fix exactly? And I would, you know, I reminiscent of John Snowblin. Well, let's create a crisis so we can fix one. And in fact, that was in education in those days.
Yeah, and you know, I owe my political career to John Snowblin and Mike Harris. But so a couple of things on this. I mean, there is a lot to say about what's going on in the school boards, and I will start where Amanda left off, that a lot of people are frustrated. It makes me livid that that trip to Italy happened. You know, it makes me so angry that that trustees take advantage of their position. But that it makes me angry when politicians do that in general, you know, but when trustees do it, it makes the news because a lot of people are disconnected from school boards, disconnected from schools. They don't know what school boards do. And so having a supervisor go in, we actually, when we were in government, when I was the premier, we actually put in place the ability for the provincial government to supervise. Actually, it might have been when I was Minister of Education. I can't remember, but we changed the rules. It doesn't have to just be for financial mismanagement. It can also be for other issues where there's dysfunction. There can be a supervisor put in place. So, you know, we recognize that there were problems, that there often are problems, that there needed to be extra tools that the provincial government had. So I don't have a problem with that at all. I think that, you know, school boards need to get their acts together, just like every other order of government. But what I will say is, to your point about Paul Calandra and the creating a crisis, I believe that there are people in the premier's realm, and I don't know whether they're in his office, but there certainly have been since the Harris years in the provincial conservative ecosystem, people who would like to get rid of school boards altogether. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if the surprising thing that they do, Amanda, is put out some kind of statement that they're going to do a review of whether we need school boards, or, you know, some kind of hint that that's the direction that they are going. And there are lots of people who we know who would cheer about that. You know, I mean, I go on Talk 1010, John Moore would get rid of school boards tomorrow. So, you know, I know that that's a sentiment. I will just say this, having been a school trustee and having been the Minister of Education and having been the Premier, I do not believe that parents and communities would be served well by the kind of small and yet important issues that families have to deal with at the local level being dumped on the lawn of Queen's Park. I think that there is a strong argument for having people in the community who can navigate the school system with families, who can respond to the policy issues that are happening locally. And remember that school boards were the first order of government that we created in this country. Before we had councils, before we had provincial governments, we had school boards, because that was the closest level of government, the closest governance issue that families felt. So, and I think, I mean, Keith, you can probably speak to this, but in Nova Scotia, I believe they got rid of school boards and then had to reinstate a regional version, because that gap that was left by the local accountability was huge. Final thing I will say is that there are huge funding issues. When you talk about the special needs students, Dave, you know, there's $1,000 to $1,500 per pupil gap in what school boards need in order to keep up with inflation. So, the government can say, oh, well, we're giving this much money to special education, this much money to the boards, but they have not kept up with the costs of just the payroll deductions that they need for their staff. So there's a funding issue in this province. The provincial government's not going to talk about it, but it's real. And the Ontario Public School Boards Association is on it. And, until that is resolved, you're going to continue to see schools saying, we don't have the staff resources to deal with an inclusive environment that we are mandated to put in place. Kids have a right to education in this province. And when they're excluded from schools because there aren't enough education assistants, that's a funding issue and that needs to be resolved.
So, John, when we talk about this kind of issue, and again, this really kind of kitchen table for so many families, but it's not relevant to maybe anybody around this table in terms of our present experience. But there are a series of those, whether it's education, whether it's kids with disability, whether it's kids living with autism, their families, all of those sorts of things. At what point do you think that any of this begins to cut through and make any difference? Because we've been talking about these issues long before you and I launched this podcast in 2018.
Yeah, and I know teachers who have to deal with this stuff. We have a goddaughter who started in French school as a teacher, 18 months or 2 years ago. And my goodness, the stuff that's going on and, how they have to cope with this, especially with the cutbacks with some of the assistants in the area. So I think you hear it, and especially from those parents who, have to deal with stuff like this, it's really, really difficult. I would say that this issue, the first time I came across it was about 1991. The chair of the East York Board of Education was a guy named Ken Maxted. And then behind the closed doors, they gave themselves a big raise. And it was a citizens group that riled up, and it was called Stop Trustees Overpayment. Stop. It also gave birth to a bunch of political careers, Dave Johnson being one, who then went on to be education minister. And it was a hammer that came down at that time around the school trustees and the school boards. And then over time, it got loosened up again. And a lot of it was around, fiscal transparency and costs. I think if you, did a poll nowadays and asked people whether they thought that there was waste that needed to be trimmed at school boards, the answer would be yes. And it's, the demonstration is spending $150,000 to go off to Italy when it could be spent more in the classroom or on even getting a few assistants to take up that well-needed those spots, I think is the sort of thing that the public goes for. So I think the time to go through school boards and to provide some transparency and get the house in order is now. I think people are concerned that there is a real fiscal drift, that they have no accountability, and that this is something which needs to be done. So, I mean, the trustees have got themselves backed into this corner, but I think the public would be entirely on board if there was even a task force that went in and blitzed all of them to find out where there was waste and inefficiency. And again, this is something that's been brought on by the trustees themselves. It's, it may be underfunded, no question about that, but I believe that the public would believe that funds need to be reallocated to where they should be, as opposed to simply spent on things that they believe are waste within the school board system itself.
Yeah, but Keith, the whole issue here is the degree to which the public is engaged in this particular level of government as well, because the voter turnout is really brutal. I can't name the trustees in the boards in my neighborhood anymore because, again, my kids are out of school, so I'm not even close to that. So it's easy to say, there needs to be accountability, and when you look at all the money that they're spending, and there is something to that criticism. But the degree to which people are engaged in that, I think, is a real issue. And so it's harder to make conversations around transparency when the audience doesn't give a rat's rectum about what you're talking about.
No, they're not paying any attention, as you say, especially if they don't have kids still in the system, until they hear that 4 trustees went to Italy on a $150,000 trip to buy statues. Now we're engaged all of a sudden. And what we found out was there's no accountability here. None of them resigned. Not one of those 4 people that spent, come on. the optics of this is just right off the bat terrible. They knew it. The public knew it. As you say, this is why people who don't pay any attention to school boards now are going to pay attention, because this is abuse of taxpayers' money. If you're saying, and I think there's no doubt that the schools are underfunded, especially when it comes to special needs kids and children living with autism. Absolutely, they're way underfunded. These children are being just poorly treated by the education system and nowhere meeting the mandate that they're supposed to be entitled to. But where we go from here, I mean, I don't know. How do you get the school boards to be more accountable unless the government, the province, is in a position of literally removing the trustees? Or do you have a voter recall? The fact that none of these four resigned, to me, was shocking. And it just shows that we do need to see something from the provincial government on holding the school boards to be more accountable. But the boards maybe, or the teachers, the unions altogether, need to get their messaging out on how underfunded they really are. And I hear the boards, they're basically trying to blame teacher absenteeism for their funding shortfalls or for their accounting shortfalls at this point. I don't know if that's the way to go. You need a united front on how the province is not keeping up with inflation in funding education programs.
All right. Well, let's leave it there. Spirited conversation. When next we meet, sound like the witches in Macbeth, but when next we meet, we'll have a new federal government, and so be curious to talk about that. Amanda Galbraith, thanks for joining us. It's always great to have you around the table and sitting in for our friend Tim.
Thanks for having me.
John Wright is here. Keith Leslie, Kathleen Wynne. I'm Dave Trafford, and again, we'll keep an ear and an eye on the developments, of course, of everything's going on this week and right through until Monday. And we might threaten to do a show, before our regular drop, just to kind of sift through the entrails of the final vote. All right, that'll do it for us this week. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford. If you are listening on the podcast apps, I'll get it out of me, Apple, Spotify, iHeart, etc. Make sure you subscribe to the show. If you're watching it on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, because you get this and now and next. Next week, we'll have our cast on, our comms and strategy team, so they'll be able to give us their take on the election outcome as well. So you can find that at Dave Trafford podcasts on YouTube. So subscribe there. That would be great. All right, that'll do it. Have a great weekend. Get out and vote on Monday. And otherwise, I don't want to hear you complaining. Enjoy it. Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network.
I have a YouTube channel right here, as you can all people see. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content. Look at this. Bye now.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.